Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. My name is Beth Voronyuk. I'm the policy lead at the Equality Fund, and I'm very pleased to be the moderator for today's session on Canada's feminist recovery plans for the COVID-19 pandemic, organized by the City for All Women Initiative here in Ottawa, otherwise known as COWI. Bienvenue. Cette session se déroulera en anglais, mais les questions dans l'une ou l'autre des langues officielles sont bienvenues. I am participating in this virtual session from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. I offer this land acknowledgement as a recognition of the generations of Indigenous people who made their homes here and as a step in the journey of reconciliation between Indigenous communities and the settlers who came later. I recognize that feminist recovery plans must incorporate the history and perspectives of Indigenous people and hope that our discussions today contribute to decolonization and justice for all. Please take a moment to reflect on the traditional territory where you're sitting. In Canada and around the world, we have clearly seen that the COVID-19 pandemic has had dramatically different impacts on women and men, on racialized communities, and on LGBTQ2S people. The evidence is mounting. By the end of April, here in Canada, 2.8 million women, 30% of those working, had lost their jobs or were working less than half of their regular hours. Very quickly, we also heard about the shadow pandemic in Canada and around the world as domestic violence rates soared. Data from last month from Toronto showed that Black people and other people of color represent a staggering 83% of reported COVID-19 cases, while only making up half of Toronto's population. Around the world, women make up 60 to 80% of healthcare workers. The pandemic has also made very real the unequal sharing of unpaid work within families. A new global tracker found that over 60% of the COVID-19 measures adopted by governments in 206 countries more than 60% of these did not include measures to take into account gender differences or inequalities. Yet, during the COVID pandemic, feminist organizations have been busy drafting intersectional responses to the pandemic and our recovery. This event brings together feminist recommendations for equitable and intersectional recoveries at the national, provincial, and municipal levels. We would like this event to be as interactive as possible in this virtual space. To this end, we invite you to post questions and comments in the YouTube chat. We will be live tweeting the event, and we encourage everyone to tweet using the hashtags that are on the screen. We have three absolutely fabulous panelists to take us through this discussion today. I'm going to introduce them as I pose the first question. First, we have Anjum Sultana. Anjum is the National Director of Public Policy and Strategic Communications at the YWCA Canada, the country's largest and oldest gender equity organization. Anjum is the primary author and operations lead for a feminist economic recovery plan, Making the Economy Work for Everyone, the first nationally focused recovery plan of its kind. And you'll be able to see the full bios for our panelists in the chat. So Anjum, my question for you is, Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland announced at the end of November the first steps in a multi-year plan to build a Canada-wide childcare system. Could you tell us a bit about YWCA Canada's Feminist Economic Recovery Plan for Canada and the recommendations to increase investments in childcare? Why is it so important to focus on childcare in a national document?
Absolutely. So I guess I want to first begin with thanking the organizers for this incredible event. And actually it's been incredible to see civil society organizing across what we call here Canada. And I think in many ways we are leading in a global conversation around feminist recovery. Apologies, there's a lot of sun here in Toronto, also known as Tuckeronto, and that's where I'm calling in from today. One of the things that we saw right away in the early part of the pandemic. So on March 11th, when the World Health Organization called COVID-19 a global pandemic, is how important it is to invest in community and care. Right away across the country, we have YWCAs that operate in 300 communities, and they were seeing on the ground the devastating impact of this crisis, but also the neglect of public policy in actually addressing the needs of people for generations, right? And so this is actually in many ways, and people have talked about this pandemic has shown us what was already broken in our society called on this land. And so because of the severe gendered impacts, we need to center the communities who have been most impacted. And that's what our plan worked on and what many plans here today will be talking about. Within that, it's so crucial on a national level, but also on a global level to have conversations about the care economy, because that is the aspect of society. It doesn't matter what type of crisis or calamity hits our country, hits our communities, we will always need care. And actually, globally, the International Labor Organization has said there's a deficit in the number of care workers with respect to the number of people that require care or need care. And it's one of the truest statements of life. Um, some point in your life, you will either need care, provide care, or that will be at a later stage of your life, maybe, or earlier stage. Care is consistent in our lives. So for us, a big piece of our feminist recovery plan was investments in childcare. The fact is, childcare is a multi-jurisdictional issue. It is something where the municipalities have to play a role, the federal government has to play a role, and provinces and territories. And unfortunately, for decades, nearly 50 years, on Monday was the anniversary of the Royal Commission on the Status of Women report. We've been calling for this for at least 50 years in this country. But it's always been something, well, is that government's responsibility? Is that government's responsibility? But, one of the good things about this pandemic, or silver lining, if you will, is that it has shown us how crucial cooperation is for addressing systemic issues. It's not enough to say this is part of my wheelhouse. We need not only the different governments working together, but civil society, labor, government, the private sector, business, all of us. And so childcare represents that legacy in many ways for this country post-pandemic. What will be the legacy of this moment? How will people remember us? And I would hope that this is the moment that we can actually say this started the journey towards early learning and childcare. I will say we're cautiously optimistic, but the thing is, we know what priorities are based on how much money we put into it. So, 20 million over 5 years for a secretariat is a positive start, but truly to get the type of sector or system we need $2 billion plus per year, and that increasing on an escalating way. So I'll stop here, but just to say, childcare is a legacy piece for our country, and childcare is something that is always going to be pandemic proof. Regardless of what happens in society, we will always need care, we will always need childcare and elder care.
Thanks, Anjum, and thanks for that context. I think the background is really, really important on how we locate childcare within the broader care issues, and also why we have 50 years, as you say, of this being on the agenda and the lack of movement on this. Our second fabulous panelist is Angela Marie McDougall, who is a founding member of Feminist Deliver, a provincial organization dedicated to shedding a light on the urgent issues facing marginalized communities in British Columbia and the grassroots struggles leading the way for transformative change while building transnational connections between grassroots intersectional feminist movements and re-envisioning the global women's agenda as one that centers a diversity of grassroots intersectional voices. Angela Marie, can you tell us a little bit about the Feminist Deliver paper, The Economic Labor Hurts the Arch of Our Backs? I love that title. That's fabulous. It's a feminist recovery plan for the province of BC, and its recommendations are unique in that it really sets out standards for equity. Why is it important to take an intersectional approach in a feminist recovery plan?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for the question, and thank you to the organizers and for the invitation. I'm here in these unceded and ancestral territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam people. My people don't come from this land that we now call Canada. My ancestors come by way of Western Africa and in northern Sweden. And Vancouver is the only home that I've known. And I'm, Feminist Deliver grew out of an analysis and looking at Women Deliver, the conference that was held here in Vancouver over a year ago, and really wanting to grind down to understand the grassroots experience. And we are a coalition of around 40 organizations all across British Columbia. And the thing that we've discussed, and then I have to tell you that the title of our report came from our previous program coordinator, Priscilla Umolo, who had recently had a baby and was had a young child, and so she was talking about what it means to be in labor and the pain of the pain in the back labor. So it's kind of an inside joke, and so I appreciate you sharing about the title. And we've been thinking so much about this idea of a just recovery or recovery, and even that term, which of course grows out of mainstream and traditional notions of the economies and economics. And we've been thinking a lot about how we can imagine something beyond recovering and what could be an equitable transformation, and thinking about transformation in this time, because as we know, if we think about the World Bank and for that matter, the Bank of Canada and other banks within nation states have talked about the necessity of nation states to, at this particular point, is to not think about the deficit, like to throw that out, and rather to spend and to do whatever it takes right now to try and deal with what is one of the most extraordinary times that we've had, under colonization and in a global sense. And so what that means in terms of spending, the recovery so far is really benefit 2/3 of the population of the highest wage earners, which, read white men in sort of more traditional spaces. And so the idea of recovery, I think, is entrenching some of this well-worn path of the economies, which is to privilege those that are already privileged. And so, thinking about how we were grappling with the report, I have to tell you, like, all of us are a part of frontline organizations. And when the pandemic hit, we were scrambling in major ways to respond to what was right in front of us, with respect to gender-based violence, all of the stuff around safe spaces. And so we scrambled to actually write a report because we wanted to have our voices on the table. And that's why I really appreciate this chance to talk with you today. But one of the biggest things that Anjem spoke to this is this piece around the public-private split. And, traditionally, and particularly under colonization, the private realm, women have been relegated to that space, and with the picket fence, and particularly for white women. And so this piece around the private realm has been a place of subjugation for women for so long. And for women that are Black, women that are of color, women that are Indigenous, the experiences of the public and private realm have been apart with respect to the economy. Both the paid and unpaid labor have been rooted in our experiences. So the piece on the public and private realm matters when we're thinking about transformation, because we've been moved into the private realm, and that the boundaries that are encased in the structures of the built structures of our houses and apartments is where our lives are primarily at the moment. And that is in part why there's been such a regression in terms of women's advancement, is because the private realm has never been considered a legit space. And so we're now grappling with what has been already baked into the economy, if you will, versus the public economy versus the unpaid labor of the private realm. And so we know that women are doing a triple duty again, but in really precarious circumstances. And you talked about gender-based violence and sexualized violence in relationships. And so what we think matters, and this is touched on in our report, is that these are some things that government can do right now as the impetus in terms of spending. So childcare for sure. And Anjem talked about the levels that needed to be committed to that, and we haven't seen that yet. Hopefully that will happen after 50 years. But the investment in Indigenous women-led solutions. And we do our land acknowledgements. And so this is really about recognizing the role of Indigenous women in these territories, and so investing in Indigenous by and for led solutions, as well as looking at the experiences of Black women, both in the economies, but also the experiences of equity, and to the extent to which we have equity here. And then the piece that mattered to us a lot was the microeconomies, and specifically about social enterprise. There is investment there that that should happen. This is a way to build community-based solutions. And because we are a coalition of frontline organizations, we cannot ignore the vital role of the nonprofit sector. The nonprofit sector has been incredibly important right now in providing critical and vital essential services all across the lands, but certainly in British Columbia, and does not have a meaningful representation or even acknowledgement with respect to being a legit sector representing, if we're going to talk about the growth and those measures of growth, thousands, hundreds of thousands, and even billions of dollars, but also labor. In British Columbia, over 70% or 80% of folks employed in the nonprofit sector are women. And this is and has been extraordinarily important in meeting the crisis needs of what the pandemic has posed. So the investment in the nonprofit sector is critically important. An investment in Indigenous women-led solutions. And we, of course, want to see Canada, advancing all of the action that is necessary on the national inquiry. Redressing harm is something that matters in these times, and that will build us toward a more equitable future. And I'll stop for now. There's a few other things I'd like to say. I'll stop for now. Thank you.
Yeah, it sounds like a very comprehensive plan that has really reflects this emphasis that you mentioned on putting the firsthand perspectives front and center. It sounds incredibly valuable, and I'm also reminded of the criticism of the phrase "build back better." That's not we want transformation, as you so craftily formulated in your response, and what we just don't want to go back to the way it was. We want something different to replace it. Our third panelist, I'm very pleased to welcome, is Dr. Valerie Stam. And Valerie is the Executive Director of the City for All Women Initiative here in Ottawa, otherwise known as COWI. COWI works with women and other marginalized genders to promote equity and inclusion at the municipal level. Valerie has a PhD in sociology from Carleton University, and her work centers around gender equality, racial justice, and participatory learning. So just as Anjum has worked on a plan at the national level, and Angela Marie has worked at the provincial level, COWI has worked on a plan at the local level. So congratulations on this first municipal gendered recovery plan. Could you tell us a bit, Valerie, what makes this plan different from plans at the national level or the provincial level?
Yeah, thank you so much, Beth, and thank you to everyone for being here today. It's just such a pleasure to be able to bring together so many amazing people who are thinking about these things, and from all across the country and from all different levels of government as well. The analysis, I just think it's a really exciting webinar for us to be a part of. So I am speaking to you today from the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabeg peoples. And similar to what the other panelists have been saying, we really, COWI, our staff, our membership, we were really inspired by the words of Indian novelist and writer Arundhati Roy. And she wrote an article at the beginning of the pandemic that said, the pandemic is a portal. And it's an opportunity to look back and reflect on how society's been operating before, but a chance to break with that and see what do we want to create that's new, that's different, that we can do things in a better way. And we can walk through this portal, reimagining the future and thinking about a different world and making that world possible. And so that article and her words really inspired us to write this recovery plan. Our recovery plan is focused on Ottawa. We're hoping to work with other municipally focused feminist organizations over the next year and create one that is more generic, that can apply to other municipalities. And I think, first of all, there are not that many differences between what we're all saying. I hear echoes of our plan in the other plans at the other levels of government. So there are a lot more similarities than differences. The reason why we felt it was important to focus at the municipal level is that cities and municipalities are where people live, where people work, where they play. It's really where we're interacting and engaging with others. These are our homes. And so this level of government is a really pivotal and important one. And the decisions that are made at this level of government impact our lives in really basic ways, such as housing, such as security, other types of infrastructure. Angela was talking about the importance of social infrastructure, right? So all of these things really get funneled down through at the municipal level, and municipal decisions have the power to impact people's lives in very specific ways. And a big thing that we noticed and worked on during the pandemic and talk about in our recovery plan is people's access to public space. And you know, we've noticed in this pandemic, and even before with the Black Lives Matter movement and I Don't Know More, you know, these movements have really drawn attention to the ways in which Black bodies, Indigenous bodies, racialized people, how they're policed in different ways than white people are, and how their access to public space is managed in different ways and policed in different ways, and often in violent ways. And what we noticed in this pandemic was that this was happening also in terms of public health restrictions and guidelines, right? So the way that racialized communities were policed in terms of the pandemic was very different from the way that white communities were. And so we wanted to bring attention to this issue and talk about what cities can do differently, how they can work in a more intersectional way, in a more gender sensitive way, particularly on this issue of public health and access to green space. And we feel that, first of all, you know, planning, and if we think long term, the way that green spaces and public spaces are designed really needs to have an intersectional gendered approach to it. This means thinking about how different people use the space in different ways, how they have access to the space in different ways, how space is resourced in different communities in different ways, and really taking a more critical look at how the ways that racism is perpetuated in our creation of public spaces. And linked to the pandemic, you know, we were really focusing too on doing education before enforcement. So, and looking at how we could do education in better ways and take enforcement in a way almost out of the picture entirely. So we were really encouraging City Council to set up a park ambassadors program, for example, where people would engage with community members in a different way. We would love to see these park ambassadors be hired from the communities in which they're engaging, and so that, you know, culturally, linguistically, they're able to cross barriers like that and connect with the people that they're talking to, that they're doing outreach to on these public health issues. And especially at the beginning of the pandemic, because there was so much uncertainty, so much different information circulating, I think it would have been really key to have people who represented their communities, who were hired on as these educational ambassadors to do more awareness on that issue. The other thing I wanted to mention, and it's been brought up before as well, is the importance of social infrastructure. And as Angela was talking about, we see that playing out in different ways. And it again gets funneled down to a point and to a breaking point at the municipal level. And a key piece when we talk about the double burden of care, which Anjum was speaking about, with the pandemic, yes, women continue to take on the majority of caregiving in the home for elders, for children. But in addition to that, what we're seeing with the pandemic is that it is women who are more often represented as essential workers. And so not only are we taking on more care in the home in this moment, we're also taking on more care in terms of our pandemic response. And so this is putting an extra layer and an extra level of responsibility on women and of work on women as well. And so we're dealing with the pandemic in very different ways, I think, than the general population. And on that note, I agree with Angela, and we've talked about it in our plan as well, that social infrastructure really needs to have a greater injection of financial support. We've seen it be progressively defunded since the 80s, and now we're paying a price for that. And we're seeing how women are paying a price for that in particular. I think I'll leave it at that and turn it back over to you, Beth. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so we've heard a bit about plans at the national, or alternative plans at the national, at the provincial, at the local level. As Anjum was mentioning, often action gets stalled here in Canada because governments pass the buck from one level to another. I'm wondering what the response has been to the plan when you've shared it with officials. Has there been take up? Has there been interest? Are elected officials and others willing to engage in discussions? Is there, who would like to jump in? Anjum, go first.
Yeah, so we released our plan at the end of July 28th. I remember it so clearly. And one of the things we did was really push the piece around media relations, because we knew it is absolutely important to get this in front of government, different stakeholders, elected officials, but also to create the public pressure for this. And I think across this land, feminist movements, feminist organizations have been creating that, that sense. You cannot ignore this issue. This is one of the big stories of this pandemic, the gendered and racialized impacts of this crisis. And so what we also did, and I think many of us on this panel have done this, is said, here's the data, this is undeniable, but guess what? Here are concrete solutions. And you can't say you don't know, because here we are telling you. And for us, it was really powerful to have that kind of multi-pronged approach. So some of the things that we have seen is, for example, about 2 months after we released our plan, in the speech from the throne, we actually saw, much of the language that we echoed in our plan echoed in the speech from the throne. So a commitment towards a feminist and intersectional recovery, post-pandemic response and recovery, a commitment towards early learning and childcare across the country, but also an action plan on women and the economy. One thing I want to touch on is that, and both of my fellow speakers have talked about this, women workers have been at the front lines of this crisis response, but they are rarely at the leadership table. Globally, 70% of healthcare workers and care workers are women, but only 25% at those leadership levels are women. So there is a disconnect. Similarly, for COVID recovery task force, only 23% globally in a survey of 30 countries found that were women, right? So we're seeing this disconnect that is quite egregious. And so we were glad to see this action plan on the women and the economy, and a commitment towards a diverse task force. It's still unclear who is going to be on this task force, but what we've been pushing is to ensure gender diversity on this task force, intersectional identities represented on this task force, but also women majority sectors. Because like Angela mentioned, over 70% of workers in nonprofits and charities in this country are women. And so when we're talking about getting gender equality addressed during this crisis and to ensure we can protect it, this 30 years of progress, those are one of the sectors we need to invest in. And that was one of the things that we did not see in the speech from the throne and did not see in the fall economic statement. But I will say what has been really interesting is that we've been asked to do briefings for the city of Toronto, the city of Vancouver, Halifax. We've been asked to talk about this in different parts of the world as well, Australia, for example. So we're seeing that there is this thirst and this desire and this hunger for this type of reshifting. And I want to talk about history, right? Pandemics have been in history this moment of catalyzing change and shifting economic system. So I'm thinking about the bubonic plague, right? And how that helped to contribute to the shift away from feudalism. That is something that we've seen in our public health history, coming from a public health background. So I see in many ways this pandemic being that catalyst for shifting the economic kind of systems we're in, right? Steering away from capitalism. And I think the British Columbia Plan talks about this quite well. We need to reshift what truly matters. And I think one of the ways we do that is by changing what we measure. So right now in the fall economic statement, they talked about, they're looking at employment rate to kind of figure out, should they kind of ease the gas on investment and stimulus funding? But we would say, you need to complicate that. You need to look at, are the jobs that are coming back decent jobs with good benefits like paid sick leave? And similarly, it shouldn't just be, is GDP back to pre-COVID levels, but have we addressed income inequality? So I think for us, we saw lots of promising pieces and the government has been responsive at the federal level, but I think we need to make sure that we make it more complex and nuanced than it currently is, because we can't have a simplified approach to this crisis because it's a complex crisis. But I think that's where civil society comes in. So I think what I would encourage governments is to bring in civil society to be partners in this. We need to have all of us at the table because no one part of society will get this on their own.
Great. And that last point, that's certainly something I heard in Angela Marie's opening remarks too, about the saying about nothing about us without us is so vitally important. And also when you look at, in addition to all the statistics you were going through, Anjem, I'm always discouraged when I see the numbers of who's considered an expert on the pandemic, that despite this, we know where the impact is falling, it continues to be, these people are not represented in telling these stories publicly of what the impact of the pandemic has meant. But Angela Marie, NDP government in British Columbia, have you had traction? Are people listening to the analysis and recommendations in your plan?
Well, we're in a wait and see at the moment. I mean, we've had, we're in the process of getting to know who are our new government. We've got some new folks there. But one of the really exciting changes, and this, is about what I was talking about before, was the creation of a parliamentary secretary for community development and nonprofits. And this is the first of its kind, I think, and certainly in British Columbia. And though it's not a cabinet position, it's a parliamentary secretary position. And Nikki Sharma is the MLA that's in that role right now. What the goal is to advance the common goals for public well-being and recognizing the vital role of nonprofits. And this is, I think this is really important, especially as I said earlier, and what has been said by others here, is the role of the nonprofit sector in terms of being lots of women, and also the critical services that are being provided. So I would think that that's a really important thing to advance, and so that there is a mature, grown-up relationship between government and nonprofits. I think in general, maybe we haven't gotten the respect, perhaps, because of the other economies, if you will, or other economic drivers like tourism or other sort of business, and just the idea of who gets to talk about economics. I mean, it's been the bastion of white men for like probably the beginning. And so the idea, as Angela said, about looking at something different, what are we measuring? And coming down to some looking at our values and our worldview. And this is a chance really to shift the worldview to something that's more equitable for sure, to seeing the land as not something to be exploited, but something that is sacred. Looking at our relationships with other non-human species, recognizing the ways in which hierarchies exist and power imbalances are, and building more equity within those, which is what intersectionality, you know, as Kimberly Crenshaw, from a metaphoric point of view, desired us to be contemplating. And so, you know, I know that we are working right now as Feminist Deliver to build our relationships with the provincial government. I mean, we've been really critical of our government in a sense, for not advancing some aspects of the work that we see, particularly around Indigenous sovereignty, and particularly related to violence against Indigenous women and girls. I mean, we've had not only the national inquiry, but a provincial inquiry, and those recommendations go a long way to addressing so many things that are troubling with and that are problematic within Canada and with British Columbia specifically. So we think that that's, you know, that actually needs to be prioritized, and so we want to stay hot on the heels of all levels of government to that effect. And then I guess the final thing that I'll say, just in terms of what we are looking for in, you know, in BC is, you know, seeing the nonprofit sector as being important, but it really, we have to look at the role of policing. And I was really glad to hear my colleague talk about policing and violence. And I'm going to just talk about Waterloo, which I actually saw something the other day, that Waterloo has reduced their childcare spaces in order to help fund police. And so I think we have to complicate this relationship with police and really look at that, and to kind of get a sense of the value that they're adding with respect to gender-based violence versus a community-based response. I think these are things that are important on a social level, but ultimately are about of dollars and cents in terms of, you know, which pot of money gets spent here and which pot of money gets spent there. And so these are questions and areas of focus that I know that we are embarking on with our new provincial government.
Great. Well, we certainly wish you lots of luck in those discussions. Valerie, what's been the reaction at the local level in Ottawa to your plan?
Yeah, thanks, Beth. I would say Cowie has a really unique relationship with the city of Ottawa. On the one hand, we've been working closely with them since 2007, I believe, on our gender equity and inclusion lens. Is something that we've co-created, and we help give training to city staff and elected officials on this lens and how it can be applied in sort of daily city operations, policies, practices. On the other hand, we also do play an advocacy role at City Hall, and you know, we are there, you know, bringing up points that people aren't necessarily always so comfortable with, or, you know, pushing the envelope in different directions. And so we really have this unique relationship where we're sort of inside and outside at the same time. On that note, so our plan's fairly new. It's just been a bit over a week since it's been launched. And we've gotten a few expressions of interest from different councillors. There's been a lot of interest on Twitter. And I think we saw this just as the beginning, and that this document is something that will carry our advocacy on for quite a while. So we're looking forward to seeing how we're going to engage on different specific topics in the document as we go forward. On the other note that we wanted to work on is really thinking about how can we share this document with other municipalities. And so we are really looking forward to the working group meeting this afternoon that's going to happen with other feminist organizations focused at the municipal level to see how can we work together to scale this across Canada and make this available and collaborate with other feminist organizations who are doing similar things. And also with this conversation, how can we talk about the intersections between all three levels of government and how we can all work together because as we were talking about earlier, they all do connect, right? And the issues such as childcare, such as housing, right? It's at all three levels of government. It's very layered and very complex and nuanced. So how can we work together to keep pushing this feminist agenda forward in terms of recovery and response planning?
Great. Yes, such an important issue to look at. We're going to go now to some questions from the audience, and I'm going to ask different members of our panelists to respond to different ones to try to get a discussion going. Anjem, I'm going to throw this one to you first. Can you comment on how we may address the intersections between violence against women, gender-based violence, and systemic racism? I'm assuming this was something, links were made in your report on this. Did you have any concrete recommendations for the federal government on how to bring a response to these two issues together?
Yeah, and this is an example of issues. Many of the issues we talked about today were concerns well before this crisis, for generations, for centuries. And I think what we have to look at is what has already been put out in terms of recommendations. So when we look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to justice, so many of those calls to justice calls to action have not yet been implemented. Similarly, for the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls and Two-Spirit Peoples, the calls to justice there really speak to the connections between gender-based violence, ongoing systemic colonialism and racism, and how it has created these cycles of violence that have been on this land for generations. So I think one of our clear recommendations is, right away implementing those calls to action, calls to justice. In addition to that, one of the things civil society has been fighting for a number of years has been a national action plan on gender-based violence. The United Nations has called on all nations to have this in place by 2015. It's now 2020. We're 5 years late. And, we have seen, things like a strategy at the national level, but the reason we need a plan is that there are so many aspects of society that support survivors of gender-based violence, but there's a lot of gaps at those intersections. And so what we need is, again, this is yet another multi-jurisdictional issue. We need the federal government, the provinces, the territories to be coming together with Indigenous governments to figure out how do we actually make a violence-free future. In this age, in this time, we need to be thinking about how do we ensure that this is actually one of the most severe and the most wide-scale human rights violations on this land, and also just generally in the world, violence against women, gender-based violence. So it is not only a human rights issue, it's a moral issue, it's an economic recovery issue as well. One of the questions we were asked, right, when we put forward our economic recovery plan, is why are you talking about gender-based violence? Why are you talking about systemic racism? Those were actual questions, right? Because I think people's mind always focuses on jobs, and it comes from that extraction, right? Like, how much productivity can we get out of people so we can continue the society? But in a climate of fear, violence, racism, discrimination, how can you have economic recovery, right? And so for us, all of these things are interconnected. But what I would encourage the folks who ask the question really civil society and Indigenous communities and racialized communities and Black communities have been calling for recommendations for generations. So those were some of the recommendations we amplified, in addition to the National Action Plan, which we're hoping to see some action on before the close of this year, going into next year. But we are already 5 years too late. And the thing is, every 6 days, right, we're seeing the impact on communities across Canada. So it's something we can't wait anymore.
Right, as we're still in the middle of 16 days for action, we're reminded of the numbers every day, but I think in this particular period, they really come home. Angela Marie, there was a question for you in terms of your comments on the nonprofit sector. And the person writes, while I really appreciate your words, one caution would be many nonprofit sector organizations are white run and using colonial systems, which should be addressed as part of systemic racism and the recovery plan. Do you have specific suggestions on how the sector itself needs to change, or what could be done so that these investments that you're proposing really can deliver on this transformative change that you've so articulately outlined for us?
Yeah, we don't definitely, and thanks for the question. We definitely don't want to entrench the nonprofit industrial complex as a oppressive force in in civil society. So what I think that this idea, kind of focusing in this way, it does give a chance then to apply a decolonizing lens, an anti-racist lens to nonprofits. And that it goes hand in hand. These things go together. The necessity of deconstructing the extent to which nonprofits become an oppressive force, and as the question states clearly, re-entrenches what are already problematic approaches. One of the things I think that matters is the part around community-based solutions, and the role of the community can often be, is actually the power of grassroots organizing. So, not all nonprofits are sort of created equally. There's, we can look at nonprofits in a bunch of different ways. What I really think, and my point is to, and I speak, and thinking about the organizations that are a part of Feminist Deliver, that are on the front line in major ways, and are working in ways to bring a decolonial lens to the practice, to integrate anti-oppression, anti-racism practices, and to advance these progressive ideas through their practice, through their organizational structure, and building more security in terms of employment and unions, and supporting labor in that regard. So, this is a chance for transformation, for sure, which includes transformation of nonprofits.
So across the board. Thank you for that. Valerie, I'm going to give the next question to you. Anjum's spoken about the importance of childcare and the care economy in general. There's a question here about including care for adults with disabilities. And they mentioned that this is an often forgotten area of care, and also care for elderly and seniors, family members, different. Can you, do you have a comment on how this relates to recovery at the local level?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I agree that adults with disabilities are often forgotten when we do think of care. And it's, part of the capitalist system that we're embedded into, right? Everyone is sort of expected to be this sort of economically productive member of society, and other facets of ourselves are not deemed as important or worthy. And I think that as we think about recovery, I go back to the words of Arundhati Roy, and just being inspired by also what I see on the ground in terms of movements and movement building. I think hearing from grassroots people organizing at the ground is a really inspiring place to take our cues from in the nonprofit sector, and to build a different way of doing things, and a different set of priorities, a different way of valuing the human experience, and what we all contribute to our society. In terms of the recovery plan specifically, I do believe bringing in a strong intersectional lens that has strong gender disaggregated data disaggregated along other lines, other identity factors as well, will help create a really robust recovery plan at all levels of government that will include adults with disabilities, will include other persons who have been forgotten or often not included in these decisions. And so, I really do think that intersectionality offers, an intersectional perspective offers a unique and a valuable way of looking at things and of creating things that allows us to do things differently, and to imagine things differently and in a different way. And so I hope that by bringing these conversations forward, and hopefully with the federal government's commitment to feminism, that we will see some changes in these areas.
Great, that's great answer. So we have we have a few minutes left, about 5 minutes left, and there are some interesting questions coming in. One that maybe all of you, and it might be the wrap up, depending on how long you take, or I might be able to squeeze one more question in, is about how we can keep the momentum going. How can we continue these discussions? How do we engage diverse women and non-binary people in these discussions? There's a specific, how do we engage Indigenous young women to participate? Do you have any things that have worked for you, or any advice for others of how to center these really important voices in these conversations? Angela Marie, do you want to go first?
Yes, well, that is the goal. I mean, that is the thing to do, and to put the energy there. I mean, transformation relies on that. And if we're really going to have something that's just in a recovery, and I struggle with that word, because for me, recovery means returning to, it really has to be about a transformation. So that's where it's at. I mean, we know that youth, and especially Indigenous youth and Black youth and youth of color, have had the biggest losses, economically, and the future is precarious. And thinking about what economic options are there. So helping to mobilize youth for themselves, and for their supporting their agency, and their to take action for the things that matter, and creating that space is vital right now. And I need to do that myself, in terms of ensuring that there is legit space and resources that are for youth and young people, and especially Indigenous people, who, by the very making of Canada as a nation, have been structured to, and to relegated in a structural way to be the most disenfranchised within our communities. And that's the, Canada keeps doing that. And even when we talked here about the National Inquiry, which has the calls for justice, are really clear about wanting to support Indigenous young women and Two-Spirit folks. And however, the National Inquiry, the rolling it out is under the Ministry of Indigenous Affairs, who, unfortunately, that ministry was based on raising the land of Indigenous people. And so it's hard to consider that would be the ministry to roll this out. I have been highly critical of that, in a sense, because it's the structures, the government structures, have been really problematic. And so on the ground, we through the community-based organizing, we have to continue to hold government accountable, and at the same time put all of our energy into ensuring that Indigenous women, Indigenous young women, are centered and are in positions to be able to take action that then defines our actions in terms of non-Indigenous people and and people in positions of power.
Thank you. Valerie, a couple minutes to you on engaging and centering these voices, and what's been the interest of young people, young women in particular, in looking at dealing at alternative plans at the local level?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it makes me think of all the things that have been happening, this summer with the Black Lives Matter movement, with Indigenous issues as well, and the people that I take my inspiration from are really those who are at the grassroots level, and they tend to be young people and young women in these communities, young Black women, young Indigenous women, who are really calling for change and imagining a really different future, and daring to imagine what that looks like. And I think there are a lot of, I think we're living in a moment where this is really coming out in strong ways. And I see it, it's not just localized, it's happening, across the country, across the continent, in different places. And that gives me a lot of inspiration. And I feel like, it's almost the reverse in a way, right? Like, in a way, we at Cowie are taking our cues from what these women have been imagining and sharing, and we're working with them to try and create a different future. So I think the more space we can give to people who are thinking creatively, who are thinking out of the box, who are thinking differently, and the more we can dare to think through that with them, and dare to think about creating a different world and a different future, I think the better off we'll all be.
So that portal that Arundhati Roy talks about, that we go through that in a different way. Thank you. Adam, the last 2 minutes, really 2 minutes, are for you, because I have a little bit to do right before the hour. But over to you on young, involving diverse young voices in these conversations.
Look, this is what keeps me up at night as a young woman myself. This is exactly the challenge of our time, because the decisions that are going to be made are going to be felt for generations to come, my generation and generations after, and all of us. So I will say one thing, is how do we actually put the insights from young people at the center? So one of the things we've been doing is around how do we actually influence the public policy discourse. Media advocacy is a really powerful tool at our disposal, and there are gendered inequities, right, in terms of who actually gets to be spoken, who gets to speak in media, and the number of references to women in sources, for example. But then when you look at it through an intersectional lens, it's even less so. So one of the things we've been really pushing for is how do we position young women in particular to be thought leaders, to be decision makers. So we've actually partnered with the Canadian Council for Youth Prosperity. And next year, we're working towards a youth-led COVID recovery plan. It's something that the Canadian Council for Youth Prosperity is shepherding. They've hired 80 young people from across the country to help write and craft this plan. And so I think that's going to be a really powerful thing that all civil society can do. How do we actually deploy resources and just, provide that space to actually create those solutions? Something also, just even in the YWCA plan, the entire plan from start to finish, the writing, the design, the project management, the strategic communications was all done by young women of color. And so we really are seeing that if we create space, that can actually influence the public policy discourse. So I think, you know, media advocacy is a really important tool, but also investing directly in the communities to create the solutions that they want for themselves and their communities.
Very exciting. And actually, we did not plan this, but your comment feeds right into the next step, which is a really short-term call for action that we're inviting everyone on this call today to retweet or share the most recent post on Facebook and Twitter, or write your own. There should be some sample tweets popping up on the screen. You could say something like, for Canada to adequately respond to COVID-19, every municipality and province needs to work together and push for a hashtag feminist recovery plan. There's some hashtags that you can use: Feminist Recovery Plan, hashtag Feminist Recovery Canada. We encourage you right now, in the next half hour, get online and see if we can make a little ripple on the importance. We encourage you to have a look at the 3 plans. If you haven't done so, there's lots of really good, solid recommendations, analysis, data, ideas to inspire you. Keep watching the social media, Facebook, Twitter, your inbox for updates. Let's put some pressure on elected representatives at all 3 levels to include a feminist lens in all the policies and programs responding to COVID. As Valerie mentioned, a small group of municipal feminist organizations, including COWI, le Conseil de Montréalaises, the Montreal Council of Women, the Prince Edward Island Women in Government, and Women's Advocacy Voice of Edmonton, will be meeting this afternoon to discuss how to work together to advance a feminist recovery agenda at the municipal level across Canada. If you have other ideas on how to share and convene, please post them in the YouTube chat. And thank you so much to Cowie for convening us. And thank you to Anjum and to Angela Marie and Valerie for your brilliant insights this morning, this afternoon. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.